What if I told you that one of the most powerful dynasties in history didn't fall to war or rebellion, but to something far more sinister, something they inflicted upon themselves? This is the story of a child born not as hope, but as a living curse, the final warning of an empire that refused to see its own reflection. Welcome to Sinister Empires, where we uncover the darkest chapters of royal history that textbooks never dared to print. Madrid, winter of 1661. Deep within the stone walls of El Escorial Monastery, the wind howls like a creature possessed, as if nature itself can sense the horror about to be unleashed. The air hangs heavy with incense, sweat, and something else, something metallic and unmistakable, the scent of royal blood. Behind a thick oak door, Queen Marianne of Austria fights for her life, her screams tearing through the sacred halls like nothing human. This isn't just the pain of childbirth. This is the death rattle of a dynasty clinging to existence with bloodied fingernails. The room is chaos, knives glinting in candlelight, towels soaked crimson, whispered prayers that sound more like pleas for mercy. And then, suddenly, silence. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. The door creaks open. There's no celebration, no joyful announcement. Only a pale midwife stumbling out, her trembling hands painted red. She doesn't need to speak. Everyone already knows. A child has been born, but this is no prince, no golden heir to secure the future. What she carries in her arms doesn't cry, doesn't move the way a newborn should. His tongue protrudes grotesquely, too large for his malformed mouth. His jaw juts forward as if his face was sculpted by hands that had forgotten what human beings were supposed to look like. His eyes, open but unfocused, stare at nothing. His limbs hang limp, lifeless, a body without resistance or will. There is no life here, only the cruel illusion of it. And yet they kneel. Every courtier bows their head in reverence. Every priest makes the sign of the cross with shaking hands. The maids weep, not from joy or relief, but from something far darker, pure, unfiltered fear. Because this twisted, broken thing is royal blood. Because his name is Habsburg. Because no one, absolutely no one, dares to speak the truth that burns in every eye. This child is not an heir. He is an omen, a breathing prophecy of doom. If you're loving these forgotten tales of power and tragedy, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button right now, and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel, connecting us across the world through our shared fascination with history's darkest secrets. Royal blood. The phrase sounds sacred, doesn't it? Majestic, untouchable, divine. But what the Habsburg court never spoke aloud was that this blood wasn't just blessed. It was poisoned, twisted, coiled on itself like a snake swallowing its own tail in an endless cycle of self-destruction. And at the center of that genetic nightmare stood Charles, the child who didn't come to save a dynasty, but to expose its rotting foundation. There were no tears of joy that day, no celebrations, only the beginning of the greatest act of pretense the Spanish court had ever performed. Before we dive deeper into this forgotten story of survival and suffering, take a moment to appreciate these hidden truths of history. We're exploring ancient stories together, connected across time and space by our curiosity about what really happened behind palace walls. Long before Charles even opened his eyes, if he could see clearly at all, his fate had already been written in blood. His broken body was simply the newest link in a chain of errors repeated with religious devotion for generations. You see, in the Habsburg court, love was never found beyond the palace walls. It was found in the mirror, in portraits of your own family, in the familiar contours of faces you'd known since birth. For centuries, the most powerful dynasty in all of Europe nursed a dangerous obsession with one word: purity. Not purity of soul, not purity of faith, but purity of blood, an idea disguised as nobility that concealed something far more disturbing, a genetic neurosis that would eventually devour them from within. They distrusted outsiders, rejected foreign blood as if it were plague, and placed their faith only in themselves, in their own reflections, as if a bloodline could be preserved by sealing it in an airtight chamber. And so the Habsburg family tree didn't grow outward like a normal dynasty. It curved inward, folding back on itself like a clenched fistful of shattered bones. Joanna of Austria, one of Charles's direct ancestors, was already a walking testament to this inherited deformity. Walk through the gilded halls of the palace, and you'd see her portrait among dozens of others, a gallery of broken mirrors reflecting the same twisted features over and over again. Exaggerated jaws that jutted forward unnaturally, eyes that seemed to sink into skulls, mouths that couldn't quite close properly. That famous Habsburg chin wasn't some charming family quirk to joke about over dinner. It was an alarm bell, a visible symptom of mouths that couldn't form words, tongues that prevented normal speech, brains that simply failed to develop as they should. Behind all that marble and gold, behind the appearance of imperial might, the empire was rotting from the inside out. The rate of inbreeding among the Spanish Habsburgs had reached catastrophic levels, the kind of genetic overlap you'd normally only see between full siblings. But in this family, it wasn't an accident or scandal. It was policy, calculated strategy. Marriages between uncles and nieces, between first cousins, between siblings separated by only a generation, bloodlines merging and collapsing without pause. A hall of mirrors that ended up reflecting only disease, decay, and the slow march toward extinction. And in the midst of this distorted logic, Marianne of Austria was born, not as a human being with hopes and dreams, but as a genetic instrument. She was elected not for love, not for political alliance with a foreign power, but for her DNA. She was King Philip IV's niece, his own brother's daughter. And then she became his wife, his queen, the mother of his children. They shared more genetic material than most fathers and daughters. When the court learned that Mariana was pregnant, they celebrated with feasts and prayers. An heir at last, a promise of continuity. The dynasty would survive another generation, but the seed was already poisoned before it was even planted. What was growing inside Mariana's womb wasn't savior. It was a final, undeniable warning that the system was collapsing. From the earliest months of pregnancy, rumors started to circulate behind the heavy tapestries and closed doors. Extreme nausea that left the queen bedridden for days. Fainting spells that came without warning. Violent mood swings that terrified the servants. But every uncomfortable truth at court was buried, ignored, swept under priceless rugs, because to acknowledge an anomaly was to acknowledge that the entire system, the entire philosophy of royal purity, was fundamentally broken. When the day of birth finally arrived, the horror became flesh and bone. The child emerged without the healthy cry of a newborn, his skin an unnatural shade of gray, his limbs hanging limp and powerless. The silence that filled that room wasn't reverence or awe. It was pure, paralyzing terror. The royal doctors, well-rehearsed in the art of deception, delivered their scripted lie with straight faces. He is weak, they said, but with time and God's favor he will grow strong. And the palace accepted it because the alternative, the truth, was simply too scandalous, too devastating to speak aloud. Charles wasn't just a sick child who might recover with proper care. He was a physical embodiment of centuries of arrogance, the collapse of a bloodline that had played God with human genetics and lost. He was a catastrophic mistake dressed in royal velvet and gold, but they could never, ever admit it. There was no consummation, no miracle, no hope. The parade of doctors began, each one more desperate than the last. They brought tonics and aphrodisiacs, ground pearls that cost more than a peasant would earn in 10 lifetimes, Spanish fly imported at great expense, extracts from exotic animals killed in distant lands. But there was no potion on earth that could repair what had been broken at the genetic level, no remedy for a bloodline deformed from its very roots. Charles was sterile, a king without seed, an empire with no future, and ending with absolutely no possibility of continuation. Maria Louisa, his young bride, withered beside him like a flower deprived of sunlight. She stopped eating, her appetite disappearing along with her hope. She stopped speaking, her voice fading into the oppressive silence of the palace. She died at just 26 years old, officially from an intestinal obstruction according to court records, but unofficially from something far simpler and far more tragic: despair. Pure, crushing despair. Charles screamed before her coffin like a wounded animal, tore at his own hair with trembling hands, begged to sleep next to her decomposing body. He promised he would join her soon, swore he would follow her into death. But he didn't. He couldn't even do that. And just a year later, like replacing a broken tool, another wife was imported from abroad. Maria Anna of Neuburg, strong German, supposedly fertile according to propaganda that preceded her arrival. She came with an entourage of priests and midwives, hope packaged in royal garments and political promises. But the result was exactly the same: silence, humiliation, emptiness echoing through marble halls. Yet the machinery of power, that great grinding apparatus of empire, did not stop. Even though the king forgot the names of people he'd known his entire life, even though his flesh slowly disintegrated like meat left too long in the sun, even though he could no longer climb a flight of stairs without collapsing halfway up, they dressed him every single morning. They placed a heavy crown upon his malformed head. They opened the throne room doors with ceremonial flourish. The empire pretended it was still alive and thriving, but all that actually breathed was a corpse of the past, held upright by lies, desperate prayers, and a collective refusal to acknowledge the abyss opening beneath their feet. By the time Charles reached 30 years old, his body no longer truly inhabited life. He had become a ceremonial object, something to be dressed and positioned and displayed, but not present in any meaningful sense. He was like a pillar of salt from biblical legend, held upright only by habit, by paralyzing fear, by a glorious past that absolutely refused to fade into history. Every single day, the same grotesque ritual repeated itself with mechanical precision. Servants woke him from whatever half-conscious state he'd fallen into during the night. They washed him with warm cloths, their faces carefully blank. They dressed him in brocades and velvets he could no longer feel against his numb skin. They seated him carefully on his throne while his slack lips murmured names of people long dead, lost somewhere in the fog of his deteriorating mind. The court observed him with a strange mixture of devotion and barely concealed horror, not for what he was as a human being, but for what he represented as a symbol. Charles was no longer a man. He was a boundary marker, a warning sign, the visible limit between before and after, between empire and collapse. Queen Maria Anna, growing increasingly isolated and increasingly powerful, kept the charade running with iron determination. She ruled from the shadows of palace corridors, signed royal edicts in his name with his seal, controlled access to his bedside like a guard protecting a holy reliquary. Not out of love, she'd never loved him, but out of cold political necessity. Because as long as the king drew breath, however shallow and labored, his enemies could not legally claim the throne. As long as the king technically lived, the myth could be sustained. But cracks were spreading through that myth like fractures in ancient stone. Inside the palace walls, the atmosphere had become absolutely suffocating. Not from the stench of his failing body. They'd grown accustomed to that, but from the tension. Every single day could be his last. And when death finally came, chaos would follow immediately. No one dared speak this truth aloud, but everyone knew it, felt it pressing down on them like a physical weight. The ambassadors of France and Austria spied on each other in the gilded hallways, watching, waiting, positioning. Royal advisors murmured in Latin amongst the stained glass and imported marble, their coded conversations echoing off stone walls. Letters flew back and forth across Europe, sealed with urgent wax, because everyone understood that what hung in the balance wasn't just the life of one broken man, but the political future of an entire continent. Charles had written multiple wills, several contradictory versions, each one influenced by different factions, political pressures, whispered advice, and desperate prayers. There were days when he seemed to favor France as his heir, other days when Austria appeared ascendant, and between these moments of confused favor, the kingdoms of Europe braced themselves for the storm they knew was coming. Because whoever inherited this poisoned throne, war was absolutely inevitable, and through it all, the king simply gasped for breath. his lungs filled with fluid that gurgled audibly with each shallow intake. His feet swelled grotesquely like diseased tree trunks. The skin stretched tight and discolored. His urine smelled sharp and metallic, a scent that servants dreaded. His skin changed color from week to week, pallid gray shifting to yellowish, then to an alarming purple. But nothing was quite as disturbing as his eyes, growing ever more empty, ever more distant, as if they had completely stopped looking at the world around him and could only gaze backward at shadows of what once was. The religious rituals continued with obsessive regularity. Masses were celebrated daily in his honor. Priests sang litanies at the foot of his enormous bed. Sacred relics were placed in his trembling, skeletal hands by monks who could barely hide their revulsion. But absolutely nothing changed. His body didn't react. His soul, if it remained at all, gave no response. Only silence filled the royal chambers, thick and heavy. And that silence was a death sentence delivered slowly. The doctors had long ago stopped speaking of cures or recovery. Now they spoke only of containment, of managing the inevitable decline. They fed him with silver spoons like feeding an infant, tiny spoonfuls of broth that often dribbled back out. They changed his soiled clothes 3 times a day, a task no one wanted, but everyone was forced to share. His bones had become so impossibly fragile that even gentle pressure could fracture them, so they moved him like he was made of glass. He slept with his eyes half open, a disturbing sight that unnerved even the most hardened servants, as if death itself still didn't quite dare to look him directly in the face. And yet, impossibly, he didn't die. That became his final form of reign, this agonizing waiting. A reign measured not in victories or decrees, but in broken breaths, in intermittent heartbeats, in clocks that seemed to have lost their hands entirely. The entire court existed suspended in that terrible waiting, as if time itself had frozen, as if the entire imperial apparatus of power depended entirely on whether he would take one more labored breath. Out in the city beyond the palace walls, ordinary people had stopped asking questions about their king. There were no more religious processions in his honor, no more crowds cheering for royal appearances. Only rumors that spread like disease through the streets. Whispers that the king was actually a dead man who simply didn't know he was dead yet. Stories that his soul had fled his body years ago, leaving only an empty shell behind. Dark jokes that his body was being moved by invisible strings like a grotesque puppet. Some faithful subjects still prayed for him. Others laughed bitterly at the absurdity. Most simply tried to survive another day. But the empire, the great sprawling empire, continued to pretend with elaborate theater. Official paintings still showed an upright, healthy monarch dressed in shimmering gold. Royal letters spoke confidently of wise decrees and kingly decisions. The court chronicles wrote glowing accounts of his deep religious devotion and contemplative nature. The image being sold to the world was that of a wise, thoughtful king, personally touched and blessed by God himself. The truth, however, was infinitely simpler and infinitely more brutal. Charles II was disintegrating, inside and out, a living monument to the fatal consequences of genetic arrogance. Not before the people, not before the Vatican, not before the enemies circling like vultures, waiting for any sign of weakness to strike. So the theater was constructed, the elaborate scenery erected, false smiles painted on every face. They dressed Charles in miniature armor that weighed down his frail shoulders, hung medals around his neck like ornaments on a dying tree, taught him to grip a scepter even though his hand couldn't close around it. They seated him on a throne even though his spine couldn't support his own weight. They called him His Catholic Majesty, the King of Spain, ruler of an empire that stretched across the known world, even though he couldn't form a single coherent sentence. From the outside, Spain still appeared to be a mighty empire, flags flying, armies marching, gold flowing from the New World. But inside the palace walls, it was already beginning to smell like confinement, like fear, like flesh rotting in the darkness where no one dared to look. In the shadowy corridors of power, the nobles began to whisper among themselves when they thought no one was listening. Some spoke of curses passed down through generations, others of divine punishment for sins no one could name. But very few, almost none, had the courage to point to the simple, terrible truth staring them in the face. There were no witches brewing potions in the night, no demons possessing the royal bloodline, only duplicated chromosomes and the crushing weight of ancestral pride. Charles was a prophecy made flesh and blood, a warning that had been centuries in the making. He had no voice to speak with, but his body spoke volumes. Every stumble, every vacant stare that looked through people instead of at them, every drop of saliva that escaped the corner of his malformed mouth was a reminder written in suffering. The House of Austria didn't need foreign armies or assassins to destroy it. It had destroyed itself from within, one arranged marriage at a time. From the moment of his birth, Charles was more symbol than human being, more political necessity than actual person. A fragile emblem clutched by trembling hands, wrapped in hollow promises and desperate prayers. The entire empire, gigantic and worn down by its own weight, revolved around his broken body, as if sheer fiction could somehow sustain reality. His childhood was nothing but a carefully choreographed performance of awkward silences and manufactured celebrations. Every developmental milestone he failed to reach, every babble that never formed into words, every step he didn't take when other children were running, every gaze that never quite focused on the world around him, all that was concealed beneath layers of prayers, clouds of incense, and thick coats of gilded paint. When Charles finally took his first steps at age 5, wobbling and stumbling like a dying old man taking his last walk, it was celebrated throughout the kingdom, as if he had conquered an entire continent single-handedly. But within those palace walls, everyone knew the truth they couldn't speak. Charles couldn't eat a simple meal without choking, couldn't swallow without his body rebelling against him. His tongue, swollen and constantly bruised, blocked his ability to speak clearly and made every bite of food a potential death sentence. Bread became a mortal threat. Meat became a form of punishment. His wet nurses worked in constant rotation, wiping his chin throughout the day and night as his clothes became perpetually soaked with drool, as if his body were in a permanent state of leaking away. Tutors were brought in one after another, the finest minds in Spain tasked with educating the king. And one after another, they failed. Charles didn't learn to read beyond a few scattered letters. He couldn't memorize simple sentences or retain basic information. He was easily distracted by the texture of embroidery on a cushion or the flickering flame of a candle. When spoken directly, he often didn't respond at all, lost in whatever fog filled his mind. When corrected or disciplined, he cried like an infant, tears streaming down his distorted face. And some days, without warning or apparent cause, he would unleash piercing screams that echoed to the marble halls, bite the furniture until his gums bled, strike the servants who tried to calm him. A blind, senseless, aimless fury that came from somewhere no one could reach. But even that was carefully glossed over, reframed, reinterpreted. They said it was regal temperament, the fire of a true Habsburg king. They claimed his silence was deep contemplation, that his violent outbursts were merely signs of a brilliant mind that others were too simple to understand. And thus began the great charade of the Habsburg court, a performance that would last decades. The systematic transformation of the pathological into the supposedly prodigious, of sickness into sanctity, of genetic catastrophe into divine mystery. Queen Mother Mariana, Charles's own mother, wove the intricate web of power from the shadows where the real decisions were made. She ruled in the name of a king who had never truly reigned, who would never reign. She signed royal decrees with a seal, answered foreign embassies with carefully crafted lies, received military and economic reports that Charles couldn't begin to comprehend. She became the eternal regent, a ghost queen hiding behind her son's weakness, like a general positioning herself behind a crumbling statue. Portrait painters were commissioned to paint what the human eye refused to see, instructed to create an alternate reality on canvas. They gave him a more harmonious jaw, brighter eyes that seemed to hold intelligence, a more resolute posture that suggested strength. In oil and pigment, Charles was transformed into something majestic, powerful, worthy of the crown. But in flesh and bone, in the reality of the palace, he was barely recognizable as human. The common people, starving in the streets and crushed under suffocating taxes that funded this elaborate lie, had no access to the truth locked away behind palace walls. They only saw the official paintings displayed in public squares, the rare parades when Charles was trotted out like a prize, the religious processions where faith and monarchy merged into spectacle. In these carefully staged events, Charles was carried like a withered trophy, swaying helplessly in his ornate litter, vacant stare fixed on nothing, mouth hanging slightly open as drool occasionally escaped. And yet, the nobles surrounding him applauded with enthusiasm, because the alternative to this charade was simply unthinkable. If Charles wasn't truly king, if his body was a genetic mistake and not a divine choice, if God hadn't selected him to rule, then the entire system would come crashing down like a house of cards. Then power wouldn't flow from heaven, but from pure chance, from the random cruelty of biology. And the empire wouldn't be eternal and divinely ordained, but mortal and doomed. So everything became theater, every moment a performance. Every royal council was an elaborate act with pre-written scripts. Every ceremony, every public appearance, a meticulously choreographed charade. The ministers bowed low before a young man who didn't understand a single word of what they were saying. Religious masses multiplied across the kingdom. Holy amulets were distributed to the faithful by the thousands, and rumors grew like weeds in the cracks of truth. They called Charles the Bewitched, as if his condition were the product of dark witchcraft and evil spells rather than predictable result of 200 years of blood ties between cousins, between uncles and nieces, between siblings separated only by a generation. But all the black magic in the world couldn't explain the smell that permeated his private chambers, a stench that no amount of perfume or incense could mask. The smell of open sores that wouldn't heal, of sluggish bowels that barely functioned, of a body that couldn't properly close or contain itself. The servants changed his bedsheets twice daily, sometimes more, not as some luxury befitting royalty, but because Charles couldn't control his own bodily functions. His body was slowly breaking down, piece by piece, system by system. And yet, incredibly, they spoke of marriage. They planned for it, negotiated for it, prayed for it. Because if anything kept the dying embers of hope alive in that desperate court, it was the fragile idea of an heir. If Charles could somehow father a child, then perhaps the empire would continue. Perhaps this nightmare would have meaning. If not, then everything, all the centuries of careful breeding, all the sacrifices, all the lies, would have been for absolutely nothing. A bride was selected with cold political calculation. Marie-Louise d'Orleans, niece of the Sun King Louis XIV himself, a 17-year-old girl raised in the refined elegance and sophistication of Versailles, the most cultured court in Europe. She was thrown without choice or preparation into the arms of a king who seemed more like a walking corpse than a man, more ghost than husband. Their wedding night became a spectacle played out in horrifying slow motion, whispered about for years afterward in hushed tones. Some courtiers said Charles wept throughout, tears streaming down his face as he sat frozen. Others claimed he prayed continuously, calling out to saints for guidance. Many insisted he simply stared at his young bride, utterly confused and unsure what was expected of him, until finally, in the depths of humiliation, a servant had to be summoned to the royal bedchamber to explain the basic mechanics of what should happen between husband and wife. There was no consummation that night, no hope of an heir, no possibility of continuing the bloodline. The royal doctors began their desperate procession to the bedchamber, bringing tonics and aphrodisiacs, ground pearls mixed with wine, Spanish fly preparations that were supposed to ignite passion, extracts from exotic animals that promised virility. But there was no potion in existence that could repair a genetic lineage deformed from its very roots. Charles was sterile, completely and irreversibly, a king without seed, and ending with absolutely no possibility of continuation. The dynasty's final chapter was being written in his broken body. Marie-Louise withered beside him like a flower cut from its stem. She stopped eating proper meals, stopped speaking except in whispers, withdrew into herself day by day. She died at just 26 years old, officially from an intestinal obstruction according to the palace physicians, but unofficially as everyone knew, from pure despair. The weight of her failed marriage and shattered future had crushed her from within. Charles's reaction was the closest thing to genuine emotion anyone had seen from him in years. He screamed before a coffin like a wounded animal, tore clumps of his own hair out by the roots, begged the servants to let him sleep beside her dead body, promised through tears that she would return to him, but she did not return. Death doesn't negotiate with kings, no matter how desperately they plead. And yet, barely a year later, the machinery of Dynasty demanded another sacrifice. Another wife was imported. Another young woman thrown into the nightmare. Maria Anna of Neuburg, strong-willed German, supposedly fertile according to propaganda spread by her family and the desperate Spanish court. She arrived with an entourage of priests clutching holy relics and midwives armed with ancient remedies. But the result was exactly the same as before. Silence in the marriage bed, humiliation behind closed doors, and the hollow emptiness of rooms that would never echo with the cries of royal children. The machinery of power, however, didn't stop turning even as the man at its center crumbled. Even though Charles had got the names of his closest advisors from one day to the next, even though his flesh slowly disintegrated like fabric left too long in the sun, even though he could no longer climb a simple flight of stairs without collapsing in exhaustion, they dressed him every single morning in his royal finery. They placed a heavy crown upon his misshapen head with ceremonial precision, opened the massive throne room doors for him as trumpets announced his arrival. The empire pretended with every fiber of its being that it was still alive and thriving. But all that truly breathed in those gilded halls was the animated corpse of a glorious past, artificially sustained by elaborate lies, constant prayers, and a desperate collective will to avoid staring directly into the abyss that was swallowing them whole. By age 30, Charles's body no longer truly inhabited life in any meaningful sense. He had become nothing more than a ceremonial object, something to be dressed each morning, physically raised from bed, publicly displayed during important occasions, but not actually present in mind or spirit. He was like a pillar of salt from the biblical story, held upright only by rigid habit, by paralyzing fear of what came next, by a glorious past that absolutely refused to disappear into history. Every day the same exhausting ritual was repeated with religious precision. Servants woke him from his fitful sleep, washed his deteriorating body with warm cloths scented with lavender, dressed him in heavy brocades embroidered with gold thread that he could no longer even feel against his numb skin. They carefully seated him on his throne while his cracked lips murmured fragmented names lost somewhere in a fog of time, people and places that may have never existed outside his broken mind. The court observed him with a strange mixture of religious devotion and barely concealed horror, not for what he actually was as a human being, but for what he represented as a symbol. Charles was no longer a man in any real sense. He had transformed into a boundary marker, a living dividing line between before and the after, between the glory that was and the uncertain future that terrified everyone. Queen Maria Anna, growing increasingly isolated and alone despite being surrounded by hundreds of courtiers, kept the elaborate charade functioning through sheer force of will. She ruled from the shadows of palace corridors, signed official edicts in Charles's name with a seal, and controlled access to his bedside as strictly as if it were a sacred reliquary containing holy remains. Not out of any love or wifely devotion, but out of cold political necessity and survival instinct. Because as long as the king drew breath, no matter how shallow or labored, his enemies, both foreign and domestic, could not legally claim the Spanish throne. As long as the king's heart still beat, however weakly, the comforting myth of continuity could be sustained for just a little longer. But the myth was developing visible cracks that grew wider every day. Inside the palace walls, the atmosphere had become suffocating and oppressive, not from the ever-present stench of Charles's failing body, which everyone had grown grimly accustomed to, but from the unbearable tension of waiting. Every single day could be his last. Every labored breath might be the final one. And with his inevitable death would come absolute chaos throughout Europe. No one wanted to speak openly of it. No one dared voice the terrible anticipation. But everyone from the lowest servant to the highest noble knew the truth. The ambassadors of France and Austria spied on each other constantly in the marble halls, listening at doors and bribing informants. The royal advisers murmured in Latin amidst the stained glass and polished marble, speaking in code about the future. Sealed letters flew back and forth across Europe with urgent frequency, because everyone with eyes to see understood that what hung in the balance wasn't just the miserable life of one broken man, but the political fate and legacy of an entire continent. Charles had written multiple wills over the years, several of them, all hopelessly contradictory, each one influenced by whichever faction had his ear that particular week, shaped by political pressures and priestly prayers whispered in his confused mind. There were days when he favored giving everything to France, other days when he leaned toward Austria, and in the tense periods between these declarations, the kingdoms of Europe braced themselves to the inevitable storm. Because whoever ended up named as his heir, whatever the final will said, one thing was absolutely certain. War was inevitable. The War of Spanish Succession was already being planned in a dozen capitals before Charles even stopped breathing. And all the while this political chess game played out around him, the king himself simply gasped for air like a fish drowning on dry land. His lungs slowly filled with fluid that doctors couldn't drain. His feet and ankles swelled grotesquely like diseased tree trunks. His urine smelled sharp and metallic when servants emptied his chamber pot. His skin changed disturbing colors from week to week, sometimes gray, sometimes yellowish, sometimes mottled purple. But nothing was quite as deeply disturbing as his eyes, which grew emptier and more distant with each passing month, as if they had completely stopped looking outward at the world around him and could only gaze backward at fragmented memories of what once was, or perhaps what never was at all. The religious rituals continued with increased desperation. Masses were celebrated in his honor 3 times daily. Lengthy litanies were sung by choirs at the foot of his bed. Sacred relics were placed in his constantly trembling hands by priests who promised miracles. But nothing changed. Neither his failing body showed any sign of improvement, nor did his vacant soul seem to respond to the prayers. Only silence filled the royal chambers, broken occasionally by his wet, labored breathing, and that silence was its own form of death sentence. The doctors had long since stopped speaking optimistically of cures or recoveries. They now spoke only in terms of containment and managing his decline. They fed him carefully with silver spoons like feeding an infant, spooning thin broths past his protruding tongue. They changed his soiled clothes 3 times a day, sometimes more when his body betrayed him. His bones had become so fragile and brittle that any pressure, any sudden movement, could shatter them like dry kindling. He slept with his eyes half open most nights, lids never quite closing completely, as if death itself still didn't dare look him directly in the face and claim him. And yet impossibly he didn't die. Week after week, month after month, he clung to life with the stubbornness of his Habsburg bloodline. That became his final form of reign, his last expression of royal power. Not conquest or law or justice, but simply waiting. A reign measured in broken, shallow breaths, in intermittent heartbeats that stuttered and skipped, in clocks whose hands seemed frozen in place. The entire court existed suspended in that terrible waiting, as if time itself had stopped moving forward, as if the entire massive imperial apparatus depended completely on whether he would take the next breath or finally surrender. In Madrid streets beyond the palace walls, the common people had stopped asking questions about their king years ago. There were no more joyful processions through the city, no more cheering crowds, only dark rumors that spread like disease. Whispers that the king was a dead man who simply didn't know he was dead, that his soul had fled his body years ago, leaving only an empty shell, that his corpse was moved around the palace by invisible strings like a grotesque puppet show. Some still prayed for him out of habit or fear. Others laughed bitterly at the cosmic joke, but most simply tried to survive another day under crushing taxes and ignored the theater happening behind palace walls. But the empire, the great Spanish empire that ruled half the known world, continued to pretend with every official act. The commission paintings still showed an upright, vigorous, healthy monarch dressed in gleaming gold and surrounded by symbols of power. The official letters sent to foreign courts spoke confidently of royal decrees and kingly wisdom. The court chronicles, carefully written for future historians, described his deep religious devotion and contemplative nature. The carefully constructed image sold to the world was that of a wise, pious, thoughtful king personally touched and blessed by God himself. The truth, however, was far simpler and infinitely more brutal than any propaganda could disguise. Charles II, King of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, was disintegrating both inside and out, dissolving slowly like salt in water, and everyone was simply waiting for the final collapse. His brain shut down in fits and starts, pieces of his consciousness flickering out like candles in storm. His heart beat as if dragging heavy stones uphill with each labored contraction. His consciousness drifted and floated like smoke escaping through shattered stained glass windows, never quite settling anywhere. But despite all this deterioration, no one could touch the crown resting on his malformed head. No one could speak openly of succession without provoking immediate war across Europe. And so Charles's failing body became a political battleground, not between clashing armies with swords and cannons, but between competing narratives and desperate factions, between those who secretly wanted him dead so they could claim power, and those who prayed desperately for just one more week of comfortable pretense, between those who used his living corpse as a shield against change, and those who needed him as a convenient excuse for their own inaction. Charles, completely unwittingly and without any understanding, had become the last crumbling bastion of an exhausted political model, the final shallow breath of an idea that could no longer be sustained by actual merit or achievement, only by empty ritual and stubborn tradition. And while the empire around him continued to deny the overwhelming evidence of collapse visible to anyone with eyes, he remained there in his chambers, trembling uncontrollably, dripping fluids from every orifice, visibly fading away day by day, but still impossibly without dying. When the beginning of the end finally arrived, there were no dramatic trumpets announcing it, no ancient prophecies suddenly fulfilled, no skies tearing open with divine signs. Only the same thick, oppressive silence that had enveloped every shadow corner of El Escorial since Charles's very first day of life. A silence that didn't bring peace or healing, but weighed on everyone like a physical burden. A silence that for decades had been carefully used to replace uncomfortable truth with acceptable fiction. Charles had turned 38 years old, but his body was already that of a man in his 90s, an ancient figure forgotten and abandoned by time itself. He weighed barely more than 40 kilograms, his frame withered to almost nothing. His eyes, clouded with thick cataracts that turned the world into fog, wandered aimlessly through the palace corridors as if desperately searching for familiar faces from a past that may never have existed. He spoke only in disconnected murmurs, in broken sentence fragments that randomly mixed names of people long dead with completely meaningless phrases that made no logical sense. His legs couldn't support even his minimal weight anymore. His breath carried the unmistakable smell of flesh rotting from the inside, of systems shutting down one by one. His skin had become as fragile as ancient parchment, cracking and tearing at the slightest pressure from bed sheets or clothing. And yet, impossibly, stubbornly, he still breathed, still drew air into his damaged lungs, still existed in that terrible space between life and death. The doctors who attended him, the priests who prayed over him, the foreign ambassadors who spied on him, they all knew with absolute certainty that the final countdown had begun. But no one could predict how much longer that impossibly stubborn body would endure, a body that had been transformed over the years from flesh and blood into pure symbol, into political restraint, into a convenient excuse for powerful men to avoid making difficult decisions. As long as Charles continued to live, as long as his heart kept beating however weakly, no one could legally claim the vast Spanish Empire. No one could openly declare the wars they were already planning. No one could begin the brutal work of rebuilding what had been destroyed. His death, then, had become primarily a political matter rather than a human one. The final will was drafted in secret chambers and then rewritten again and again based on who had influenced that particular week. Royal advisors debated in urgent whispers behind closed doors. To whom would Charles leave an empire that no longer actually existed except on fading paper documents and outdated maps? France pressed aggressively for the grandson of Louis the Great, the Sun King himself. Austria proposed yet another Habsburg cousin to continue the doomed bloodline. England and the Netherlands lurked at the edges, watching carefully, fully aware that any final decision would mean immediate continent-wide war. And while this high-stakes diplomatic chess game burned with speculation and secret predictions, the king at the center of it all simply died slowly, painfully, like an hourglass filled with sand that stubbornly refuses to run completely dry no matter how long you wait. Queen Maria Anna, desperately clinging to whatever scraps of power and relevance remained, continued to play her exhausting part with grim determination. She filtered every official decision, manipulated diplomatic letters before they went out, held tense meetings with papal nuncios and foreign messengers. But her face increasingly betrayed the terrible wear and tear of it all. She had aged dramatically alongside her husband, not out of any romantic love or wifely devotion, but simply from prolonged exposure to the same concentrated decay and rot that was consuming him. The common people beyond the palace walls, meanwhile, no longer bothered to pretend or maintain the comforting illusions. Their blind faith in the divine monarchy had completely unraveled with every devastating famine, every unjust crushing tax, every broken royal promise. The church bells still dutifully rang out on official royal holidays, but they echoed across increasingly empty public squares. The distant figure of the king no longer inspired reverence or patriotic loyalty, only deep pity mixed with embarrassment. Charles had ceased to function as a divine symbol sent from heaven and had instead become an uncomfortable mirror, an unwanted reflection of an empire that absolutely refused to look honestly at itself. And when Charles finally began to lose control even of his own fragmented mind, mistaking his current wife for his long-dead mother, insisting that his dead brother was still alive somewhere in the palace, demanding loudly to be shown detailed maps of territories that Spain no longer controlled and hadn't for years. Not even the most devout and faithful royalists could continue to deny the painfully obvious truth staring them in the face. The reign had effectively ended long before his actual physical death would come. In his final days and weeks, Charles existed only as a ceremonial figure to be manipulated. Servants dressed him each morning in his royal garments, physically seated him in various formal positions, quietly recited the day's official duties and schedules to him as if he could comprehend. But he no longer understood anything. He could only respond with involuntary tics, desperate gasps for air, and incomprehensible babbling. He cried out suddenly to forgotten saints whose names he'd heard in childhood. He trembled violently at his own reflection in holy water. He wept rivers of tears without knowing why, without understanding what he was mourning. He would leave no children behind. He would leave no legitimate successor to claim his throne, only a gaping void, a political and dynastic emptiness, so vast it threatened to swallow an entire continent whole. When Charles finally breathed his very last breath, it happened in the quiet early hours of morning, without any public witnesses present, without any memorable final words for the history books. Only a wet death rattled beneath the covered stained glass windows, while the few servants present, bewildered and genuinely in mourning despite everything, slowly lowered their heads in a gesture of respect that they had mentally rehearsed for this exact moment for decades. And indeed they had been rehearsing, because everyone knew this day was inevitable. The death of Charles II was not truly an ending in any real sense. It was a liberation, a release from suffering. Liberation for a tortured body that never asked to be born, that never chose the curse of its own existence. Liberation for a dying empire that had been waiting impatiently for years, even decades, for some clear sign that was finally permitted to collapse. Liberation for a watchful Europe that already had its weapons cleaned, its armies assembled, its battle plans drawn up and ready. But Charles's death was also simultaneously the beginning of something far worse than what came before, because in the space where powerful myths die, the violent struggle for the myth's corpse immediately begins. Charles II died technically alone, although he was physically surrounded by elaborate court ceremony, clouds of sweet incense, and massive quantities of cold gold. He died without living descendants to mourn him, without military victories to his name, without any real solace or comfort. But his death was not simply that of an ordinary man passing quietly from a world. It was a final prolonged agony of a dangerous idea, the centuries-old belief that absolute power, like some precious family heirloom, could be inherited across generations without terrible consequence. With Charles's last breath, the House of Austria in Spain died out completely and forever, ending a dynasty that had once ruled half the known world. What Charles left behind was not any legacy of glory or achievement, but a stark warning carved in bone and suffering, a body reduced to nothing more than a symbol, a once mighty dynasty that had literally devoured itself from within, a bloodline that had catastrophically mistaken genetic purity for protective isolation, and ended up creating grotesque monsters instead of capable kings. The royal doctors who performed his autopsy were left genuinely astonished by what they discovered when they opened his body. His heart was blackened and shriveled like burnt wood. His lungs were completely filled with stagnant fluid. His intestines were gangrenous, rotting inside his body cavity. His testicles had atrophied to almost nothing, incapable of producing life. His blood ran thick as burnt oil, dark and viscous. He wasn't simply a corpse lying on the examination table. He was a death sentence that had somehow been made flesh, a walking prophecy of genetic doom that took 38 years to fully manifest. There were no grieving children to mourn his passing, no proud father to embrace him one final time, only cold-eyed ambassadors who, before Charles's body had even cooled on the deathbed, immediately began moving their armies into position, signing secret treaties, claiming the scattered remnants of the Spanish Empire as if they were nothing more than chess pieces to be redistributed among winners. And thus began the War of the Spanish Succession, a massive conflict that would brutally ravage Europe for over a decade, completely redraw national borders, and bury tens of thousands of lives beneath the crushing weight of dynastic ambition pursued by royal families that didn't yet know they were all equally doomed to irrelevance. But the most terrible thing about Charles's story wasn't the war that followed his death. The most terrible, most damning thing was that for almost 4 full decades, millions upon millions of people actively pretended that a completely ruined body could somehow still function as a legitimate king, that a grotesquely crooked jaw, a lost and wandering mind, a fundamentally broken soul could somehow uphold and embody the grand idea of divine order and natural hierarchy. And they believed this transparent fiction not out of genuine faith or religious conviction, but out of pure, paralyzing fear. Because admitting openly that Charles was a genetic error, a mistake of biology, meant admitting that the entire political and social system was built on fundamentally flawed assumptions. And that admission was simply too terrifying to contemplate. The official portrait of Charles II still hangs prominently in museums across Europe today. In that carefully painted image, he appears dignified and regal, head held impossibly high, eyes calm and serene, body firm and strong. Every inch a king, every detail suggesting divine right and natural authority. But it's nothing more than a lie painted with oil and pigment, a comfortable fiction rendered on canvas. Beneath the beautiful surface of that artwork lies the ugly truth. A human being who was systematically transformed into a puppet, a walking mask, a soulless ritual performed for decades. A man who was never truly free for a single day of his life, who could never make a genuine choice, because he was born trapped inside an inescapable prison constructed from blood ties and an inherited surname. Charles's life was not a story of personal wickedness or evil, but of inevitable consequence. He was not a cruel tyrant or a vicious despot making deliberate choices to harm others. He was simply the final logical end result of a deeply flawed power structure that consistently privileged accident of birth over actual ability, that valued family name over genuine merit, that chose comforting myth over biological reality, a rigid system that absolutely refused to renew itself, to adapt, to change, and therefore ended up rotting from the inside out until it finally collapsed. And his image, as grotesque as it is, as silent as it remains, becomes an uncomfortable mirror held up to our faces. It forces us to look not only at one dead dynasty from centuries ago, but at ourselves, at our own modern institutions that persist out of nothing but mindless habit, at our contemporary leaders whom we still sometimes inherit by tradition rather than select by merit, at our collective lies that we continue to repeat mechanically just to avoid breaking comfortable structures. Charles II left behind no grand monuments, no progressive reforms, no measurable progress for humanity. Instead, he left us warnings that we're still refusing to fully hear. He left bones wrapped in gold and velvet. He left the cautionary story of a body that should never have been forced to wear a crown, and of a court that consistently preferred comforting delusion to uncomfortable truth, and that, ultimately, is his real legacy to us. Not a portrait that embellishes and flatters, but one that reveals and exposes. Not a tomb that honors and celebrates, but one that remembers and warns. A man who symbolizes not human greatness, but the terrible price we pay for collectively ignoring decay and decline until it's far too late. The story of Charles II doesn't actually end with his physical death in that quiet morning, because what he represents was never buried in his tomb. It lives on in every power structure that stubbornly refuses to renew itself, in every fossilized institution that consistently prefers maintaining appearances to embracing necessary change, in every defended legacy that's protected out of blind habit rather than any actual justice or merit. Charles didn't personally destroy his empire through bad decisions or poor leadership. The empire destroyed itself through its own systemic flaws and simply used his broken body as a convenient excuse for decades of decline. For years upon years, his obvious decline was carefully masked behind ceremony. His silence was deliberately misinterpreted as profound wisdom. His constant pain was hidden behind elaborate hollow rituals that meant nothing. Masses were celebrated. Lavish banquets were held. Grand parades were organized, not to celebrate actual life or achievement, but to desperately sustain a crumbling illusion, a lie so deeply ingrained in the culture that even those who absolutely knew the truth found themselves repeating it without conscious question. And how many times throughout history have we done exactly the same thing? How many times have we applauded leaders who were broken inside, damaged, and incompetent, simply because they bore a certain prestigious surname or came from the right family? How many times have we allowed considerations of blood, of caste, of empty tradition to be valued far more than reason, ability, or basic human compassion? The story of Charles II is not just another tragic tale of monarchical dysfunction. It's a dirty, uncomfortable mirror that forces us to stare directly into the very nature of power itself, into power's deepest fear of disappearing and becoming irrelevant. Because when any structure, whether monarchy or a modern corporation or a political party, is built primarily on denial, on the active rejection of science, of health, of basic human dignity, of observable truth, then collapse is not merely a distant possibility. It's an absolute destiny, just a matter of time. Charles was officially crowned king with all the ceremony that implies, but he lived his entire existence as nothing more than a symbol, and died serving as a warning that most people still refuse to hear. Now, the real question facing us is this: how many more warnings, how many more Charles II's will we need before we finally hear what history has already been silently screaming at us for centuries? Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling me what you think about this tragic tale. And don't forget to hit that like button, because only by confronting the past without embellishment or comfortable lies can we avoid repeating its very worst legacies. This is Sinister Empires, reminding you that the darkest chapters of history often teach us the most important lessons about our present and our future.